Keir Starmer needs to read the riot act to his cabinet, needs to stop this happening, put an end to all this speculation. It has been a torrid couple of weeks for Keir Starmer. The loss of his deputy, Angela Rayner, the loss a week ago of the American ambassador, Peter Mandelson, and all the questions which continue about what Keir Starmer knew when and how that decision was originally made in Number 10 and in the Cabinet Office.
What about the head of strategy going? Can I just, because you're talking about people going, that was not really much notice, but he had to resign over some extraordinary things he said about Diane Abbott. Is he a big loss?
Well, I don't know him well, Paul Ovenden, but he's clearly been with Keir Starmer a long time, and what he said was, Downing Street say, or his unattributable friends in Downing Street say was, it was a joke and this is very unfair. But I'm afraid when you look at the words, not the kind of thing you should be writing down, especially in the modern world and committing to WhatsApp. I'm afraid that's kind of another example of that. And I think it will be a loss because Keir Starmer relies upon those people around him who he's very close to, and it's a smaller band than it was before. The fundamental thing, though, is his ratings are so low, and they've continued to fall, and that's partly because of that sense of division, but also because of the cost of living crisis and the sense that people aren't feeling better off. And I guess if you're Keir Starmer, you need things which can turn this around. He's got a few big moments in the next month or two. As you said, the UN next week and the announcement about the recognition of Palestine. The following week, his speech to the Labour Party conference. A few weeks later, the budget. These are moments which are huge and which the media has to report, and they are cut-through moments. And those have to be, those set pieces, he needs people to look at and say, there's direction, I understand the values which underpin it, this is what Keir Starmer's government is all about. But the reality is that is hard in an atmosphere of swirling politics. And we've had quite a lot of swirling politics in the last week.
Well, I think what's extraordinary is, last week we were talking about the deputy leadership contest, and then it all kind of morphed into conversations about a real, like a leadership contest. But let's take them in turn. So we start with the deputy leadership contest. So that's now underway. Lucy Powell versus Bridget Phillipson. I thought Lucy Powell, who I know pretty well because she was a Manchester MP when I was an MP, on the outskirts of Manchester. I thought she did a really, really good interview with Nick Robinson. I think it was for his podcast, Political Thinking, but I heard it on the Today programme. And I think she's playing this card of being the kind of critical friend, explicitly the shop steward of the MPs. And everything she said, I thought was said with sort of moderation, but at the same time, clearly not the Starmer camp, and helped by the fact she'd just been fired by Keir Starmer. And she said explicitly that as deputy leader, she wouldn't take a job in the cabinet, and she didn't think the deputy leader should take a job in the government. That's a big challenge to Bridget Phillipson, I guess, and her, her positioning. Is she at the moment? I guess I haven't heard so much from her, but maybe I haven't been paying quite close enough attention. But has she got her hand tied behind her back in the way that you predicted she would have a week ago? And I know it's like early days, but it's a pretty short contest, isn't it? I mean, who is the moment looks like the front runner?
Well, there isn't yet proper polling. There was a Survation poll, but I'm not sure whether I would at the moment, kind of give that much credibility. But I think you are right. Lucy Powell had a good first week. It was a good interview on the Today programme. I wouldn't underestimate Bridget Phillipson. She got a lot of nominations from the backbenchers. There's a lot of respect for her as a cabinet member. Of course, if you go back a few months ago, she was one of the people being heavily briefed against by Number 10, saying that she was for the sack because she was taking, an approach to academy reforms, which people said were a betrayal of Tony Blair. And, I don't think that was right myself, but so she
That's
was.
because you agree with her on all this academy stuff rather than Tony Blair.
Well, look, as the person who opened more academies than any other Labour Secretary of State, I'm fully in favour of academies, but I think that they aren't independent schools outside the state sector. They are state schools, and have to accept their proper obligations, as do all other schools, to to cooperate around behaviour or to teach the curriculum. So I definitely do, but I wouldn't underestimate.
That's
Bridget.
code for yeah, exactly. You're definitely more on the what we now call the Bridget side of the argument rather than the number 10 side of the argument.
But that is my point, which is that Bridget Phillipson isn't simply on that issue a leadership or Starmer stooge. It was actually the people in number 10 having a go at her. However, there's no doubt that from outside the cabinet, Lucy Powell can position herself as the critical friend, passing messages in. In passing, I actually think it would be better for the deputy leader, whoever it is, to be in the cabinet, not on the outside. I'm not sure that's the right decision in the end for either Keir Starmer, if Lucy Powell makes, or for Lucy Powell. But there's no doubt that it is harder for Bridget Phillipson, and will be harder in these debates if she's tied into cabinet collective responsibility. The party is going to want a lean from the deputy leader on the issues in the Middle East and Gaza, and Lucy Powell was doing that this week, and we will see whether Bridget Phillipson follows her. And then on the issue of fairness, I mean, there is some suggestion that people are trying to turn tackling child poverty into, within Labour, like a factional divide, that if you are on the left, if you're Lucy Powell, you think getting child poverty down is really important, and therefore changing the two-child limit is important. Whereas if you are, with Keir Starmer and on the centre ground, you don't think child poverty is important and don't want to make that kind of mood. Look, I think that's a ridiculous dividing line to establish. I don't think Bridget Phillipson will lose badly in the debates if she's on that side of the argument. Bridget Phillipson and Lucy Powell both have to be for tackling child poverty, and Bridget Phillipson will need to advocate positions as Education Children's Secretary on child poverty, which go further than what at the moment the Treasury and the Chancellor want to do. I mean, we were being told a few months ago Keir Starmer wanted to move on child poverty and the two-child limit. So on that, I think she has to be given latitude or take latitude. If she is the status quo on Labour's policy in the Middle East and doesn't think child poverty is important, and the defender of, the Starmer style, very, very hard to win this deputy leadership election in the current climate. So,
although of course, in all of those positions, if you take those positions as deputy leader, you're actually ducking the decisions a real leader of the Labour Party has to take as a prime minister, which is, okay, your position on the Middle East. How do you actually have influence over what's happening on the ground there? How do you have any influence over the Israelis, or indeed, if you take positions that are markedly different from Donald Trump, have you lost kind of any influence over the Americans? And on child poverty, I don't think, of course, every Labour MP says they'd like to get rid of the two-child limit, which I introduced, although I think they are misreading how the public might react to that when it happens, and some of the cases that you're going to find if it does happen of people getting very, very large sums of money suddenly who have large families. But the question is, how do you pay for it? I mean, that's what Rachel Reeves is wrestling us with, and we'll come on and talk about that. So some of these positions in the deputy leadership contest are, like, I guess in any kind of party leadership, they're kind of, I would say, kind of swerving around the decisions you actually have to take in number 10 Downing Street.
I know, but that's not the point. I mean, I said last week, if I was Keir Starmer, I would have downplayed the importance of this election, and I wouldn't have had a cabinet member standing in the election. But they have, and so it becomes a debate about what is the cabinet going to do. Even if you don't think we should move on the two-child limit, I disagree with that, but that's fine. But that is not the same as saying it's not a priority for a Labour government to do things on child poverty. And whether it's a two-child limit or something else, Bridget Phillipson has to be advocating for action if she's going to be a credible Labour figure. But the question we were talking about was not, what is the right position for Keir Starmer in the next election? We're talking about how you win the deputy leadership election. I mean, that's the reality. And if you are on the wrong side as the electorate, which in this case is not the general electorate, but the Labour Party electorate, if you're on the wrong side of the debate on the Middle East and on fairness and child poverty, and speaking truth to power, you can say all you like, I know, but I'm for unity, and I'm for tough decisions. But I don't think that's going to win you the election, and I don't think Keir Starmer wants Bridget Phillipson to lose this election. So that's the question. I mean, we aren't talking about the election for the leader. We're talking about the election for the deputy, and and who's going to win, not what you would like them to say for the long-term benefit of the government.
Of course, lots of people are talking about the election for the leader. I mean, I thought Lucy Powell had a very good response when Nick Robinson suggested in his interview that she was a stalking horse for the mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, which we should listen to what she said.
There are people who say, hey, Lucy Powell, she's a stalking horse for Andy Burnham. That's what this contest is really about.
I mean, it's just classic Westminster bubble obsession, that, isn't it, really? You've got two strong women in an open and transparent contest. And instead of talking about the two strong women, everybody's talking about this being a sort of proxy for war between two men, which, quite honestly, I find kind of sexist.
Well, it probably does have some sexist element to it, although there is also some truth to it, which is the deputy leadership contest is seen as a kind of temperature check on Keir Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party. Now, can I ask you, why has Andy Burnham, he's not in the government, he's not in Parliament, he's the mayor of Manchester. There are a bunch of new Labour MPs and there are a bunch of Labour cabinet ministers, when just over a year ago there weren't any Labour cabinet ministers. Why is Andy Burnham the kind of king over the water? Why is he emerging as the potential replacement to Starmer? We'll come on and talk about whether that is realistic or not. But it's kind of interesting that he's emerged, because I would have thought once Labour were in government, perhaps those mayors like Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham would become less relevant, less important, because the action would be in Whitehall and Downing Street. But it's interesting. I know Andy Burnham very well. We were in Parliament together, and I helped create the Manchester mayoralty that he has occupied and I think occupied pretty well. But why are people looking at him?
Well, because he was on the Laura Kuenssberg show last Sunday at the moment of Keir Starmer's greatest vulnerability in the last few weeks, being very critical of the direction the party or the leadership is taking, and endorsing Lucy Powell to be a candidate for the deputy leadership. And, I totally agree with Lucy that this is a contest between two powerful women. But as we said on our podcast last week, it was going to be seen from the beginning by many people as a proxy battle, not least because Andy has been projecting himself into that proxy battle in terms. But I think there's a wider point here as well, which is that if you take the lesson people draw from Labour leadership elections of kind of recent years, I think the view is that if you are late out of the traps, you lose. And if you go back to 2019, well before the general election in 2019, which Jeremy Corbyn lost, Keir Starmer and his team, we now know, because it's all documented in Patrick Maguire's excellent books, were organising the Keir Starmer leadership challenge. And because you need to be ahead, you can't get caught out. And that's what Keir did very successfully indeed. And now, with the ratings low and the polling low, people are thinking, do we need to do the same thing again? And that includes Andy. If you go back to the period of the pre-election greatest vulnerability for Keir Starmer around the police investigation in Durham, we know all these conversations were happening, West Streeting, Lisa Nandy, at the time of Rachel Reeves. If you remember in the Patrick Maguire book, he documents a moment in the voting lobbies where Wes Streeting and Rachel Reeves are sitting together in the voting lobby, and Wes says to Rachel, according to Patrick Maguire, have you thought about what you're going to do if the worst does happen? And Rachel says, well, I don't think it is going to happen. But the conversation was happening. If you then transport yourself over to the last week, all of this rolling speculation, but more than that, people gearing up. I mean, there definitely will be people thinking, have I got the appointments I need? Have I got the contacts I need? Am I kind of getting myself ready? Again, Patrick Maguire, columnist in the Times, chronicler of Labour, says at the end of his column earlier in the week, ultimately it would be for the cabinet to force the issue. Like the vast majority of their colleagues, they vent their spleens privately. To do this in public is to commit career suicide. The only way this is resolved, said one Minister of the Health and Home Secretaries last week, is for Wes and Shabana Mahmood to decide who runs, get Rachel Reeves on board, and then tell Keir it's over. So Patrick Maguire reflecting that kind of speculation. Now, I think probably Wes Streeting, Shabana Mahmood, Lisa Nandy will be thinking in government, this is more dangerous. But they'll also be thinking, well, if Andy Burnham is stealing a march, am I ready if it happens? And Andy's thinking, well, if they're going to get ready, am I ready if it happens? And that starts to become dangerously self-fulfilling. And I said at the beginning, what Keir needs to do is get his big moments, get his agenda moving. But if deputy leadership and leadership speculation is taking over, that is very dangerous. It's also really important to say on this, if anybody thinks that people within number 10 are starting to sort of tilt things one way for one candidate, and therefore I need to do what I need to do to combat that number 10 effect, that then becomes kind of dangerously toxic in terms of momentum. So Keir Starmer needs to read the riot act to his cabinet. He needs to stop this happening, put an end to all this speculation, but hard to do that unless he really gets his government back rolling. That conference speech, that budget, they are now kind of crucially important. But, I don't think he can complain about other people doing in 2025 what he did very successfully in 2019.
My favourite quote, almost in politics, but anyway, in this context, is the Harold Wilson quote when he says, people think I don't know what's going on. I know what's going on. I'm going on. Which is about conversations about Wilson's leadership.
I have a feeling Margaret Thatcher used very similar words in the autumn of 1990, on and on and on, and didn't work out so well.
No, it didn't. It didn't work out well, although we did a good what if he had survived.
But this is why this deputy leadership election is dangerous, because it's sort of, aside from whether it's a proxy for Keir Starmer and Andy Burnham, it looks like the Labour Party turning in on itself as a government and having internal rows about direction rather than focusing on cost of living and the National Health Service and the economy. And the leadership speculation kind of flows out of that mood having been created over the last couple of weeks since Angela Rayner resigned. So, I think that this is concerning for Keir Starmer, and he needs to get a grip first and foremost with his own operation and make sure that nobody is feeding this.
Yeah, but you can't plead for unity. You can only lead and people will follow. And if people see you're doing the job well and you're communicating well, and you have something for people to follow, a message, a mission, an objective,
Absolutely.
then that's how to solve leadership crises. There were plenty in the Tory party, and the one thing that never works is get up and say, please, can we all be united?
No.
So he's got to, and his new team around him in number 10, or largely new team, have got to do the thing that a leader of anything has to. A leader of a football team, a leader of a company, a leader of a country needs to do, which is, this is our goal. This is what we're fighting for. This is what we're campaigning for. This is the mission. And I was going to, we should move on because we've got so much to talk about. But I thought there's an interesting change. Maybe I've misread this. I had always assumed that the Labour Party was averse to leadership changes. The Tories are endlessly ditching their leader. That's the kind of received wisdom. As William Hague said, it was reported in one of these columns this week, it's a monarchy tempered by regicide. I remember him actually explaining to the Liberal Democrats in the negotiation that. But the Labour Party was always seen to be overly loyal to its leadership, even when it's clear that it's not working. Witness, for example, hanging on to Jeremy Corbyn after he'd lost one general election. to fight the second, and indeed hanging on to Neil Kinnock in the 80s. But what about there seems to be a sort of new moral argument, which is we're going to let reform in. We're going to, there's a kind of moral duty on the left here, on a centre-left government, to not let the far right in. And that's new. I mean, obviously, in the past you would have said we mustn't let the Conservatives in. Does Farage and the looming threat of Farage kind of create among Labour MPs a kind of new urgency of, we really, really can't fail?
I hear people say that often. So I think you are right to say that is currently worrying people. People see it's existential about democracy and parties rather than simply about one leader of one government. And the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party is that the Conservatives remove their leaders, where the Labour leaders normally decide to go, but quite often they decide to go when things are kind of difficult and under pressure. In the case of Harold Wilson, it was health. But if you think of Jim Callaghan or Michael Foot or Neil Kinnock or Tony Blair or Ed Miliband, they chose to leave. They weren't challenged, but they chose to leave at a time when, after an election, it was clear that they weren't succeeding and things had to change. Now, in normal politics, you would think, well, that election is a general election in 3 or 4 years' time. But what people are increasingly saying is, well, actually, no, it's next year's local elections and the Scottish elections, which will be that moment where you can see the writing on the wall. So I think all this stuff about challenges and the Labour Party removing a leader and how difficult it is and the nominations, I think that isn't the point. The point is, as Patrick Maguire suggests, the answer would be for Wes and Shabana to decide who runs, get Rachel Reeves on board, and then tell Keir it's over. What Keir Starmer doesn't want to do is be in that position where senior people, a bit like Margaret Thatcher in 1990, are telling the leader the game is up. And I don't think at the moment, given the reform challenge and the state of the Conservative Party, I don't think that the mood will be that happens after a general election. I think that the pressure to kind of, it feels as though timelines are being shortened in politics, doesn't it? And this is just one example of that.